Hey, welcome back to Common Core Algebra II. Today's lesson is 12.1, Introduction to Probability. So mathematics seeks to quantify and model just about everything. One of the greatest challenges is to try and quantify chance, but that is exactly what probability seeks to do. With probability, we attempt to assign a number to how likely an event is to occur. Terminology in probability is important, so we will introduce some basic terms here. So some of the words from your word wall or from this lesson will be experiment, outcome, event, and sample space. And we will discuss them as we approach them on each lesson, each example. So exercise 1. An experiment is run whereby a spinner is spun around a circle with 5 equal sectors that have been marked off as shown. So what is an experiment? Okay, go here. So what is the experiment? So here is the experiment. Consists of spinning the spinner and noting the number that it lands on. Okay, so give one outcome of this. Well, having the spinner land on 4, having the spinner land on 1. So give one example. I'll just say having the spinner land on, let's say, 3. So C says, what is the probability of spinning the spinner and landing on an odd number? What is the event here, and what outcomes fall into the event? So the event is the spinner landing on an odd number. The outcomes, so the event, I'm not going to write this, you can write it down. The event is having the spinner landing on an odd number. Okay, the outcomes that fall into this event are landing on 1, 3, and 5. And what is the probability? Well, the probability of an odd number is equal to, basically, the numerator is going to be how many odd numbers there are, which are 3, out of how many possibilities there are, which are 5. And in probability, most of the time we leave it as a fraction, but sometimes you can make it into a decimal, which is 0.6, or they might even ask you what percentage, and that would be moving it over 2 places, which would be 60%. So there's a 60% chance that you will land on an odd number. So moving on to exercise 2, but before we do that, we're going to talk about the basic definition of probability. So you can see here that the probability of an event E occurring is given by the ratio P of E. So the probability of an event is equal to N of E, means the number of ways that event can happen, over N of S, where S is the sample space. Okay, so N of E is the number of outcomes, and N of S is the number of total outcomes in the sample space. So given the above definition, between what two numbers must all probabilities lie? And let's see if we have to explain this. So let's talk about that last problem that we just talked about, that with the spinner with the 5. So if we had the possibility of none of them occurring, that would be 0 out of a total possibility of 5. So this is equal to 0. And what's the possibility of all the numbers, the probability of hitting all the numbers? Well, that's going to be 5 out of 5, and that's 1. So in this case, it's going to be 0, the probability of an event occurring, and 1. So you can never have a 150% chance of something happening, just like you can have a probability of 1.5, which is basically the same thing. Because if you change this to percentages, you'd have 0% less than or equal to the probability B, which is less than or equal to 100%. That makes sense. At least I think it does. So then it says list all the outcomes as ordered triples. So what you can do is you can come over on this side and you can say, well, what are all the possibilities? Well, I'll go in order, and the first possibility is heads, heads, heads. Then it goes to heads, heads, tails. Whoops. Heads, heads, tails. Then it goes to heads, tail, heads. And then it goes to heads, tails, tails. So that's basically these 4 right here. So now we have to do the bottom 4. So the bottom 4 are going to be tails, heads, heads, and tails, heads, tails. And then we have tails, tails, heads, and tails, tails, tails. So we have 8 outcomes here. All right, so our sample space is 8. So for each of the following probabilities, base your answers on part A and B. What's the probability of getting all heads? Well, if we look at our tree diagram, we can see how we only have all heads right here. Or if we look here, we can see how we have all heads here. So that means I'm going to have 1 out of 8. So exactly 2 heads. Well, let's use a different color here. How about this one? So exactly 2 heads. Let's use our examples here. I think it's easier to see. So here are 2 heads, here are 2 heads, here are 2 heads, and that is it, correct? So I get 3 out of 8. And the probability of all heads or all tails, well, that's very similar to our all heads up here. So we have the all heads here or all tails here. So there's 2 of them. We're going to come back and talk about that in a later lesson. But it's going to be 2 out of 8. Now, you do not have to always reduce with probability. But if you wanted to, just make sure you're doing it properly. So 1/4. And unless they tell you otherwise, you always leave it as a fraction. So write down what you need to, and we'll move on. All right. So exercise 4. All right. Sometimes, let's read on top. Sometimes we have to quantify chance by using observations that have been made in real world. In this case, we are talking about empirical probability. All right, the fundamental equation for probability still stands, which means this is actual data. This probability is based on actual data. So a survey was done by a marketing company to determine which of 3 sodas was preferred by people in a blind taste test. The results are shown below. So this says find the empirical data. All right, the empirical probability that a person selected at random from this group would prefer soda B. So I want the probability of soda B. Express your answer as a fraction and as a decimal accurate to 2 decimal places, which is the standard to the nearest hundredth. So it's very nice they give us the total here, which is 53. So I know that is my sample space. I have 53 people who took this survey. And people who preferred soda B is 24. Now you can put this into your calculator and you get 0.45. You don't have to put the 0 in the front. It's just to remind you that that is a decimal point, not just a speck of dust. So moving on, this one says find the empirical probability that a person selected at random from this group would not prefer soda A. So again, express your answer as a fraction and a decimal accurate to 2 decimal places. So there's two ways that we can think about it. You can either think about it as being, we know soda A is 18 out of 53. So you can subtract that from 1. That's called the complement. Or another way you can do it is if they don't choose soda A, so this is the same thing as, that means they like B or C. So that means you're going to get 24 plus 11 all over 53. So the answer is going to be 35 over 53. And this is 0.66. So that's it for this lesson. Try to keep it. This is a real short lesson, really, only 10 minutes. But that's it. So we are done with this one, and until next time, always make good choices.